incentives such as tax exemptions. And then there's significant voucher programs in New York, California, and New Jersey that provide rebates for buses. Cap and trade funds are also in some cases available for this, and green banks are another potential source of funding for school bus conversions. So next slide. And I just wanted to also give a quick overview of the utility actions in this space. So there are a lot of utilities that are really interested in this and that are starting to develop pilot programs for using the buses for vehicle to grid. So school buses are an ideal candidate for vehicle to grid because of how they're used. So they're used for transporting students a couple of times a day, sometimes beyond that for special events and so forth. But in the summer, less heavily used, which is often utility peak demand periods. So it provides a source of battery storage that could be utilized by utilities at those times. So it aligns well with their system peaks. So the buses are not being used at those times. So quite a few utilities are looking at this in vehicle to grid or vehicle to building situations. It's also possible to use these buses for disaster recovery and response to provide power to a school that could be used as a shelter for, in the case of some kind of event where people need shelter. So we're starting to see some of these pilots do have, there's a few with some early results, but many of them are really new. And so we haven't seen, they're just launching and are trying to look at the value of the vehicle to grid, how the batteries perform, whether there's degradation, and just all of any other challenges with the infrastructure deployment or the charging patterns of these buses. So lots of movement there, a lot of new programs that have been rolled out just recently. And it is also, just one more thing, you can go to the next slide, but this can be a really helpful way, I think, using the battery to provide grid services can be a really important way to make the economics work. So it's another revenue stream, right? I think a lot of school districts are looking at how do we pay that upfront cost of the vehicle, some sort of incentives. This vehicle to grid can help just collectively address that upfront cost. So I'm going to wrap up here with a couple of the key regulatory questions or things that are coming up with school bus electrification. And I think the folks from ELPC are going to do a great job kind of taking it the next step in the next presentation here. But so one of the key issues that's come up is particularly with these utility pilots is the ownership of the bus and the battery assets, because it is a concern for schools that they make sure that they have the buses available for transporting the pupils when needed, right? So there are some questions there about the structure of the pilots and the ownership arrangements of the battery assets and the bus itself that have come up. I think safety issues and liability issues are also a concern that that utilities have raised and that they're negotiating as part of these pilot deployments. Another key issue is just deployment of the charging infrastructure for the buses. So there can be challenges in some locations. There's a depot where the buses are charged. Other school districts have a very dispersed way of parking buses, and that can make it more challenging to figure out charging infrastructure solutions. But also there can be just constraints of, trying to run the charging infrastructure in that part of the grid or in small spaces if there's not a lot of room in the charging depots. So there can be a variety of different infrastructure related challenges. And then there's these questions of utility make ready investments of any kind of grid upgrades that might be needed to run to the facility as well. So lots of questions there about who pays for the charging and how all of that works. And then finally, I think an issue that also can arise is related to the rate structures. There can be significant fuel cost savings from using electricity rather than diesel fuel for the buses, but things like demand charges can eat into savings there. And so that's an important issue to look at for ESB conversions. So we might need new rate structures to ensure that those are viable. So I'm going to leave it off there. I think hopefully I just was trying to give a big picture overview of some of the issues. Happy to answer any questions later. And I know that our friends at ELPC are going to can dig into some of that a little bit more.
Great, thank you so much. I just want to pause real quick and see if we have any clarifying questions, but otherwise we will save all the Q&A for the end. But it doesn't look like we have any right now. So I'll go ahead and introduce Susan from the Environmental Law and Policy Center, who will be talking a little bit more in detail about some of the themes that we were just introduced to. So go ahead, Susan.
Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining to talk about this important issue. The Environmental Law and Policy Center has been interested in school buses and converting from diesel to electric because, as Lori mentioned, there's 480,000 school buses running across our country every day. And as you are utility regulators, you may think of them as diesel polluting power plants on a small scale, but 480,000 of them running through our communities each day. Next slide, please. Lori mentioned some of the equity issues related to school buses, including that Black and Latino children have higher rates of asthma already and are further exposed. Another is that the wheelchair lifts in the rear of school buses are next to the tailpipe. So wheelchair-bound children are exposed longer and more than other children. So these contribute to some of the problems we're seeing with asthma now being the #1 chronic condition among American children. Next slide, please. The benefits of electric school buses clearly include the reduced health costs that families are now bearing from both children's hospitalizations, emergency room visits, parents having to miss work, but also the benefits include quiet and fume-free rides, the reduction in operation and maintenance costs for schools. Next slide, please. Studies have shown that we can reduce school day absences by 14 million school day absences per year across this country by getting kids out of old, dirty diesel school buses. And we can improve some of children's academic performance and test scores by getting them out of diesel and into zero emission electric school buses. Next slide, please. Very specifically, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency has documented the reduction in nitrogen oxides and fine particles, PM 2.5, that you all know from being utility regulators about these pollutants and their contributions to acid rain and to smog. They're also key health problems for children, children's lungs, and communities. And moving away from dirty diesel buses to electric, and especially when our electric grid is even more renewables, will be a great improvement. Next slide, please. Nonetheless, why would utilities and utility regulators focus on electric school buses when there are other electric vehicle opportunities that you are also involved in? We believe that electric school buses can be the poster child for electric vehicles. Why? They both have the health impacts to our most vulnerable children, can improve air quality in communities, but very specifically, there is a unique and large opportunity with vehicle to grid. Unlike most other electric vehicles, school buses have very predictable, reliable duty cycles. As Lori mentioned, they run very few hours, some in the early morning and the early to mid-afternoon, but almost never at night and almost never during the summer. In fact, school buses are not used 75% of the year. So they can be recharged off-peak, generally at night when there's excess power on the grid. They can be used to feed power back to the grid during peak demand times of day and peak seasons, such as the heat that is being experienced across much of our country today. So as vehicle to grid is implemented well, electric school buses can serve customer needs for cleaner air, quieter streets, quieter rides, healthier kids, helping schools with cost controls and with potential revenue streams, and at the same time helping utilities by avoiding the need for building and operating peak plants, providing load growth while also helping with power during excess periods and feeding during peak periods. Next slide, please. So I wanted to mention a bit about the experience that we've had in the Midwest to date. We've had slow but real progress, which is now accelerating with electric school buses. We learned of the opportunity to help transition school buses from unhealthy diesel to zero emission after the VW settlement was announced a few years ago. In the summer of 2017, a few Midwest-based utilities helped sponsor a 4-state, 6-city electric school bus tour that we ran with others across the Midwest. Since then, in the 4 states through which the tour went, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, and Ohio, state agencies carved out from the VW settlement a total of approximately $20 million for electric school buses in those states. That's now led to 28 electric school buses in operation across Illinois, Indiana, and Michigan, with more to come. And Minnesota PCA is about to announce something on the order of $4 million in VW settlement funds for electric school buses there. I wanted to talk a little bit about some specific examples of utility engagement in our region. The issues that they face and the opportunities that they're seeing occur across the country, but we've got experience here that I just wanted to share so you have some real life examples. Here in Illinois, Ameren Illinois' CEO, Richard Mark, early on grasped the equity component and the need for thinking about equity when thinking about electric vehicles and specifically electric school buses. He understood from his experience with children's health the need for getting kids out of electric school buses and the opportunity that it provides for Ameren Illinois to help make this transition in their communities. They offered early on to help support school districts such as those in the East St. Louis area, which is a non-attainment area, to contribute towards the purchase of electric school buses. And they recently are now the home to 2 of the first operating V2G school buses in Illinois, those being in central Illinois. One of the issues that Ameren has faced and is working through is figuring out how to assess the value to the grid. And that's an issue that each utility and utilities across the country need to assess individually, and which we are hoping those of you who are regulators can help move that forward. Duke Energy, which as you know is both in the Southeast and in Indiana, has had success in applications in North Carolina where they've had a pilot approved. In Indiana, they've been interested from the start since the VW settlement to support schools in their territory in Indiana and offered to pay up to $120,000 each, which is roughly 1/3 of the cost of an electric school bus for schools in their districts, in its territory. They have not so far been received by the Illinois Utility Regulatory Commission. The questions that have come up that are very legitimate questions and will need to be resolved in each state is what is okay for utility to pay for and what's not? Could the utility pay for or contribute to the cost of a bus? How about paying for the battery or even owning the battery? And what about the electric charging infrastructure? With Xcel Energy in Colorado, but in our region in Minnesota, they have a large pending proposal stemming from its COVID relief package, and currently are awaiting, well, there's filing still going on, but they've proposed a 20 V2G school bus pilot. And one of the interesting things about their proposal is that they are proposing 2 different levels of rebates to schools, depending on whether or not they commit to participating in a vehicle to grid demonstration pilot. They're trying to assess the value to both the customers and the utilities of these V2G buses. One thing we're seeing across the country is that it's appearing that managed charging and some form of time of use rate structure will be helpful in accelerating electric school bus adoption and making it so that these buses are a fit both for meeting customer needs as well as utility needs, to ensure that while there's load growth, it's at the appropriate time and the customer costs are kept low. Alliant Energy in Iowa has a pilot which was slightly delayed by COVID, but will be cutting edge in a different way, which is they will be testing 125 kilowatt chargers. That's much larger than the usual ones in these school bus projects, which tend to be 50 or 60 kilowatts. They'll be testing that with 2 V2G school buses at Cedar Rapids School. So this is a very exciting time for electric school buses and their potential acceleration. They are popular in Michigan, where DTE Energy joined a proposal that was put together by a number of school districts. The state ended up putting in more money than it had originally committed for electric school buses from its VW funds. Minnesota, as I mentioned earlier, has now on the verge of announcing funds allocating to electric school buses. And in Illinois, our Environmental Protection Agency has recently proposed to reallocate the bulk of the remaining VW money for electric transit and school buses. So, and we and others support those being V2G. So I'm now going to turn this over to my colleague, Rob Kelter.
And I'll try and be brief. I know we only have 13 minutes here. Susan is obviously ELPC's expert on EV school buses. I'm our expert on litigating rate cases, grid modernization cases, integrated resource plan cases. And I just wanted to sort of close our presentation talking a little bit about how important the role that we see NARUC and the commissioners playing in all of this. Because, you know, in the grid mod cases I've litigated, the microgrid cases, the utilities are pretty conservative for the most part. And for the most part, they want to keep investing money in a way that benefits them, but that's an easy way to make investments. And EV school buses are new, they're different, they're complicated. And my strong belief is that if there isn't guidance and leadership from NARUC and commissioners, and if you'll pardon the pun, if you guys aren't driving the bus, then the utilities will not get on the bus. So what we want to do is start working with you through the committee, get some conference sessions going, and then build on what NARUC does and work with you at the state level to build momentum, because utilities really do respond to cues from commissioners, commission staff, and how the state commissions just view individual issues like this. And I know, for instance, I worked closely with ComEd launching a Million Smart Thermostat program a few years ago. And when Illinois Chairman Brian Sheehan got involved and was calling meetings every few months to get updates on the Smart Thermostat program, it made a really big difference in the utilities' attitude towards that program. So I think today is really just meant to be a kickoff. We want to start a relationship with commissioners and state commissions and keep moving forward on this, so that in the context of grid planning cases, microgrid cases, rate cases, that we work on sending the right signals to the utilities that this is something positive for the communities that commissioners want to see happen. And we think of creative ways to incentivize utilities to make investments in school buses ranging from owning the batteries, the utility ownership of the batteries, to time of use charging programs that encourage off-peak charging. But the bottom line here is this: the difference between a traditional school bus, which costs about $140,000, and an electric school bus, which costs $300,000, is significant. We've got to find a way to bridge that gap. And the single most important thing that I think we can do, ELPC thinks we can do, is make sure that we value those school buses properly in terms of how they relate to the grid and support the grid, and can support the grid not only at peak times during the summer months, but also at emergency times when we need them most. These school buses are on wheels, they're mobile, they're unique in that sense, and we've got to make sure that we value them properly, and we've got to make sure that we send the right signal to the utilities that we want to see strong EV school bus programs. And for today, I'll leave it at that.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And now we'll hear from Todd at Montgomery County Public Schools.
Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm adjusting my time a little bit to get us back on track here. I just want to tell you one story of how we're doing this in Montgomery County, Maryland, how we are electrifying our school bus fleet, and maybe a model that others could use. So next slide, please. So I'm the transportation director here, and I was going to tell you where I started out. So I was a reluctant EV person, right? I knew that EVs were coming into the market, and I've been hearing in the school bus industry from manufacturers of school buses. I've been hearing from school board members and student groups and environmental groups. Everybody's saying, hey, what are you going to do about going electric? What are we going to do here to stop running those diesel buses? I actually was pretty content running diesel buses, particularly, you know, since they've cleaned up a lot since the early 2000s, and we had standardized our fleet and training and things like that around diesel buses. But I was hearing all of this talk about electric, and so what I decided I was going to do was get a VW grant, which I applied for and got, and buy one bus and try it out and see what happens. And I was pretty content to let others figure this deal out, and then if it worked, join in. My decision to buy one was disappointing to very many folks, which they loudly expressed. And here, when I thought I was delivering good news to them that we were going to try this out, it turned out it was disappointing news to them. So next slide. So I was summoned to a meeting in our county executive's office where I met a company called Highland Electric Transportation. And they had warned me what they were going to say in the meeting, which I very much appreciated. But they, during this meeting, proceeded to lay out a financial plan that said you can electrify your entire fleet of buses with spending no more money than you already were planning to spend on diesel buses. And of course, I was shocked by this news, and it sounded too good to be true, because typically right now a electric bus is roughly 3 times the cost of an equivalent diesel bus. And I couldn't quite figure out the math in my head on that. And so they presented this whole kind of financial plan about how that works. Next slide. So they, after they made this claim and backed it up with some details, which I'll share in a minute, they said, so we're ready to work with you. And so I, seeing that as too good to be true, I started to investigate the legitimacy of that plan. And the more I checked it out, the more legitimate it seemed. And so while I left the meeting thinking this is too good to be true, it turns out it really wasn't. And so I quickly switched gears, so I didn't want to get into public procurement issues. And so we issued a request for information, because I at the time didn't know anything about electric vehicles. I'm learning exponentially as we go through this project. But at the time I was very uninformed. And so we issued an RFI and got some responses that really helped us to craft a good RFP. And we wanted to find out what was out there in the market and if there were other folks like Highland or folks that had a better idea than Highland. Our RFP responses indicated to us that Highland was the best idea that we had found at the time. And so we pre-awarded to Highland Electric Transportation and entered into started working on a contract with them. We spent a couple of months building a contract around everything from usage and fees and all kinds of things that are involved in this leasing arrangement we have. And then I also spent some time scrubbing the financial model because I was about to go to my Board of Education and tell them that this was a budget neutral model. And I wanted to make sure I had my job the next year and that was actually correct. So we're under contract with Highland now for 25 buses to come this fall, 61 next fall, and then each year after that, 120 buses, which is our 1/12 of our fleet, which we replace annually. Next slide. So here's how it works. So we asked for a turnkey project because, like I said, I wanted the expertise to come along, because if I had to wait until I and my team knew enough to start designing charging infrastructure and managing charges, we still would not be on our way to this project. And so I wanted expertise to come. Of course, we wanted the use of the bus. We wanted somebody to design, install, and maintain all of the infrastructure and figure out where it goes and what it looks like and how big the charger should be and all of that. We wanted somebody on an ongoing basis to manage the charging. We included, although some people told us this isn't possible in a lease deal, we included and asked for maintenance of the bus, including the battery for the life of the bus. People told us you can't get that in a lease deal. Well, it turns out you really can. And we also asked for electric. I wanted to know, if possible, exactly what these buses were going to cost us for their entire 12 years of life, not only to acquire them, but also to maintain them and to operate. So that we baked all that into our deal. Next slide. So here's how the structure works. It is it's the same cost as diesels, and here's why. Here's how that works. So declining EV prices. So Highland locked in with the manufacturer of these buses, which happens to be Thomas Built Buses out of High Point, North Carolina. They locked in pricing over 4 years, and the prices of those buses they acquired declined in each of those 4 years. So we already know that we have documented evidence the prices are coming down, just like they did in every other electric vehicle market. It's less expensive for us to run per mile on electric than it is on diesel. We get some savings there, and the maintenance reductions are estimated around 50% of the cost of maintaining a diesel. We also are going to do in our deal some vehicle to grid, which we talked about the other presenters. And so that is also part of how this deal works and how they are able to sell us the use of these buses at the same amount that we're currently paying for diesel. And the diesel equivalent is what we purchased the bus for now, what we put in terms of diesel fuel, and then what we spend to maintain the buses will now all be going to the EV project. Next slide. Here's why it worked for us. I was not anywhere close to being prepared to take on the risks of going out and finding a big pot of money to buy electric buses and then hope over time, although it would be an informed hope, to hope over time that they really did save us in terms of total cost of ownership to bring down that initial high price down to something around what a diesel was. I wasn't willing to take on the risk of grants, right? And that they would come on a regular basis. I was not willing to take on the V2G risk. I didn't know anything about V2G, right? But Highland took all of that on and presented us with a budget neutral deal. And all of my excuses kind of evaporated all in one meeting. One of the presenters shared earlier about some risks around making sure the buses will be available for our use. We put quite a bit of that into our contract to talk about what happens if this idea really is too good to be true and Highland ceases to exist in a year or two. So we baked a lot of those what if kind of scenarios in there to make sure that we will continue to have use of the buses to transport students. Obviously, if they were to decide it wasn't a good deal or to go out of business or whatever and take their toys and go home, that would be a bad arrangement for a school district. So we put lots of those things and anticipated a lot of those situations we hope never to be in our contract. Next slide. And so I think I got us back on track with 45 seconds to spare. And so I'm happy to answer any questions that you have and discuss any of these topics. So thank you.
Great, thank you so much. And now I think we can turn it over to Q&A. So if folks have any questions, you can either just unmute yourself and ask a question. And I think we have one in the chat, which I believe Lori has answered, but maybe we want to address that question again. And I think Commissioner Bocanegra will be moderating the discussion.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Jasmine, for that. You are correct. There's actually one question in the chat, but I will give Ed a chance. I don't know if you want to unmute yourself, Ed, or I'm happy to read it for you, whatever you're comfortable with. I'll just give you a second here. If you don't respond, I'll read it out loud.
Hi, yeah, thanks. So I appreciate the excellent presentations and the information on vehicle to grid. Glad to hear that that seems to be catching on in a lot of different places. And I'm just interested in different experience in terms of the customer engagement strategy. And for the schools, are they finding that vehicle to grid is relatively easy for them to kind of understand what that means to them? And are they, it seems like a great fit for their operational schedule, but are they noticing, like, has there been any kind of a rub with the operational schedule for the school buses and the vehicle to grid opportunities? And also, are there some specific opportunities that seem to be the most promising for vehicle to grid? Is it like selling energy back? Is it like frequency regulation? Is there something else? So I know that's kind of, I'm rattling off a few questions, but yeah, I'd appreciate answers on any or all of those questions. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll chime in, and maybe other folks want to as well. But I did respond that I think one of the things that's really appealing about the school buses is that their schedule is really well known and can be established up front. And so it's clear to the parties going into the arrangement of when they're going to be available and so forth. And on the easier side, I think to figure out strategies that will work. I think, you know, I'll just reiterate that a lot of these pilots are in very early stages. There are a small number of pilots that have been implemented, but, you know, I showed a map with quite a few pilots on there, and the majority of them are launching like now, or you know, we just don't have a lot of results yet, but that's why they're looking at some of this, is to see how well it works and all that kind of stuff. So, and I will also emphasize that I do think there's differences in the approaches. So like DTE, for instance, is looking at using school buses for power during, for resiliency, for power outages and things like that, right? Whereas others are looking at it for grid services or meeting peak demand periods. So it really depends on the region, I think, what the utility needs are and what they feel like is the optimal value. It's kind of a regional question that I think is going to be different in different locations, how they're utilizing the buses. And we are seeing a variety of models emerging. So, and I don't know if others want to kind of weigh in terms of the school district reactions to the V2G concept and education. I think that is one of the things that our program could be helping with over time, is to help, you know, be providing some of the, you know, working with the school districts and try to answer questions as they come up and sharing those lessons learned across the school district. So we're hoping to be able to play a role in some of that going forward. I think, what we've seen so far is smaller pilots where there's just a lot of discussion, I think, between the stakeholders about how that's going to work moving forward. So there's a lot of time to do the education with the utility being engaged there. So, but I don't know if others have other perspectives on that or want to add in any more detail or.
So I can share a little bit about how that's anticipated to look in our deal. So first of all, I start by saying that Highland Electric is actually the customer of the utility in our deal, right? They're going to be the ones purchasing the electric from Pepco is the utility at 4 of our 5 sites, and then Allegheny Power is at the 5th site. And so Highland is ready. They're installing equipment, charging equipment that is ready to go on V2G. Pepco is not quite ready to do the utility side of the V2G, in my understanding. And so we don't know exactly when that is going to happen, but we built into our contract usage parameters for the buses, particularly in the summertime when we anticipate the V2G being the most attractive to help manage peak demand. And so Highland wanted to make sure they didn't limit our use beyond what we do now, but they did want us to put in writing what we're willing to live with in terms of usage parameters. And so what we did there is we figured out what our usage is now, and then we built in some buffer in case we increase usage for some reason. And then we kind of locked in those numbers in terms of what has to be available at what times a day to be used for vehicle to grid. And Highland said that was important to them in making sure that as they negotiate around V2G and the rates that'll be coming back to them, because they're the ones getting the revenue from that, it was important for them to be able to guarantee certain levels, right, for Pepco and Allegheny to be able to count on in terms of what they'd be getting in terms of power back into the grid at various times of the day. I think that's all I have to offer right now.
I just want to add one thing real quickly here, which is that, utilities tend to default to what they know, and using EV school buses to enhance the grid isn't what they know. So I think it's really important that, commissions urge them to take a hard look and give them a push to do this, because we know that the batteries in the school buses are batteries. They work like storage batteries. There's no great secret here. There's not a lot of risk here. It's just new and different. And I'll leave it at that.
One more thing I'd tack on. I saw a question from one of the commissioners said, how has our utility been as a partner in this deal? And while they're not ready yet to go with V2G, they've been an amazing partner in this. They've been organizing meetings around this to update us. They've been kind of helping to lead the charge of electrification for us. They've been an amazing partner at that, and doing lots of things and making sure that things that are typical bureaucratic hurdles in terms of what might delay projects and whatever are not delaying this project. They want to be full partners with us in the electrification of our fleet. So they've been, this is Pepco I'm talking about, have been amazing.
I was going to jump in here too about another part of the question that was asked had to do with school districts, in addition to Todd's in Montgomery County, and how school districts have been responding and where they are in terms of their learning curve. We've found in the Midwest many transportation directors like Todd, who initially were, as Todd self-declared, a little bit reticent or reluctant, but who have embraced the idea of electric school buses wholeheartedly. That's been the experience, for instance, in Michigan, where the Michigan Association of Pupil Transportation, which are made up of transportation directors like Todd, have the largest fleet within the Midwest across 7 school districts. They've collectively joined together to do a joint purchase of equipment. They've really educated themselves and frankly educated state decision makers during that process. And then to sort of the opposite or full on, we've seen a superintendent in Central Illinois who has now founded something called the Bus to Grid Initiative, and who's working to get school districts both in Illinois and in other nearby states to collectively join together for joint purchases and to work with utilities and the charging companies to bring this to a larger scale across our region. So we were encouraged by the learnings that school officials have taken on, and appreciate Todd's points about where he did and didn't feel comfortable, because that's true, you know, in transportation directors who are already dealing with all sorts of other issues. But it's interesting to see and encouraging to see the variety and positive steps being taken by schools.
I see a couple more questions in there for me. So one is, where the costs of the buses overcome by the contractor requiring a significant subsidy of some kind. So no, that's not, there's no significant subsidy yet. We are contributing our one bus worth of VW grant money to the effort. And they got a $850,000 grant from the Maryland Department of the Environment. So I think so far a little over $1 million, but we're getting 326 buses so far. So that's just a small drop in the bucket. So no significant subsidy right now. And then the other question is, can you share the availability schedule? Yes, so we looked at what percentage of our fleet would be on the road at any time. And so they originally came around with, I think you saw on one of the slides, an operating window that went from 6 to 9 in the morning and 2 to 5 in the afternoon. And that's what Highland originally came with. And that's, I think, what maybe some school districts have. We're running buses all day long, all over the place. And so we said we want our operating window to be from 5:30 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. And we want to be able to use 100% of our buses at any time during that whole time. And so they were good with that. And then we started to say, what percentage of the fleet could be used after that? Because we do some, you know, athletic trips and things like that, but we don't use a large percentage of our buses after 5:30 p.m. And so we said that 10% of the buses could be out up until 1 a.m. And then they were all expected back by 1 a.m. And that was less around the V2G and more around their charge readiness guarantee. Because part of our leasing arrangement with them says that every bus will be charged and ready to go by 5:30 a.m. And so they need to ensure that the bus is in its parking spot and plugged in enough time that they have to charge it. And then in the summertime, we know that we don't use more than 50% of our fleet. So we locked in some operating hours around 50% usage of the fleet. And we average that across summer days in case one day we're using 70% and another day less. And so we are finished by, I think we set it to be done by 2 o'clock in the summertime, which is, we typically run half-day programs. And then we have similar percentages. We can have 10% out after that. And then if we exceed those limits, right, because we'll be potentially cutting into their V2G revenues and causing them to not live up to their fleet availability guarantees, we actually pay a per mile surcharge for if we exceed the percentage of the fleet that's operating outside of those usage windows. But like I said, we took what we typically do, and then we added a buffer in terms of number of buses, and then we added a buffer in terms of time, because they didn't want, nor did we want, to end up in a situation where we're paying a bunch of penalty fees.
Thank you, Todd, for those answers. It looks like I don't see any other questions, but if anybody has one, oh, we just got one here. I'll read it. It's from Joy. The question is, in terms of learning about EV school buses and their V2G capabilities, what pilot size is ideal at a location? Could one EV school bus provide enough utility learnings, or would a fleet of EV buses at one location be necessary? It's a great question. Assume it's for any of you guys.
I'll just comment that I think most of the pilots are multiple buses where that's feasible, a handful of buses, up to 10 buses, or, in that kind of range is pretty common. And I think, there is some benefit to trying to do multiple buses to deal with issues of, just managing that and the charging and making sure that, there's enough charging capability to do multiple buses and thinking through all those kinds of issues. So it's certainly, most of them are structured for multiple buses, I would say. But there's limits on the size and in most cases. I don't know if others want to add to that.
I'd agree with Lori on that. Where there are multiple buses, there's better opportunities to compare experiences for more drivers to have the experience and learn about the regenerative braking that's such a beneficial aspect of these buses, for more of the maintenance staff to get experience with the buses, for more students and community residents to be exposed. So there tends to be a better uptake and better information, both for the utility where it's V to G, but also for the community at large when there can be more than a single bus in a location. And that's certainly been the experience in Michigan, where 7 school districts got buses pretty much at the same time, and they've been sharing information and across the state this way.
Thank you. I have a question for Lori, but I suppose the question can also be answered by our other speakers today. So my question for you, Lori, is, at the beginning of your slides, you talked about some of the objectives or targets. I think your slide mentions schools, manufacturers, utilities, policy, and partners. In your opinion, is any one of those, I guess, most challenging when trying to address school bus fleets? And I think we all often hear that funding continues to be a challenge on a variety of fronts, not just school buses, but is there anything in particular that you think we should know about that has been challenging in this context?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most critical issues that we're going to be dealing with is how to cover the upfront cost and how do we scale manufacturing fast enough to be able to reach those economies of scale. I mean, if you look at we talked about earlier, I think Rob mentioned that an electric school bus is north of $300,000 compared to a diesel bus of $100,000, right? So it's a big gap. If you look at the cost of the batteries and cost of batteries today, it's not, it's a much smaller amount, $25,000, $30,000 or something in terms of the battery cost, right? So but one of the key challenges is that many school districts have their own requirements, safety requirements that the bus needs to meet. Like it can vary by school district or by state, that they almost need to be built individually to meet those requirements that can differ even within a state, but also across states. So that's one of the challenges of being able to get to economies of scale to bring down that cost. I think it's really very feasible to be rapidly reducing the cost of these buses if we can achieve those scales. I mean, the other critical issue, Todd's example is excellent, right? Of trying to be able to do a large amount of fleet, right? And they were able to sign a contract that's cost neutral in that way, right? And those kinds of approaches, what other kinds of business models or financing structures can we come to address those upfront costs, right? We were just talking to the Department of Energy loan program who has interest in supporting these kinds of efforts and could work with intermediaries or school districts to help finance bus procurement. So we're going to be spending a lot of time trying to help figure out those kinds of solutions to really address the upfront cost and the manufacturer scaling. I think there has been quite a bit of momentum already on the policy side, right? There's a lot of discussion at the federal level, which would be huge too, right? If we do get some federal incentives that can just accelerate this market so much more rapidly. And there's a lot of, as I mentioned, it's in the infrastructure deal framework that was just released. So that's positive. And it's been in a number of other, raised in other legislation and plans. So I don't know if others have thoughts on that too, but I think those are some of the major issues.
Yes, thank you so much. And if you guys want to jump in at any time, just let me know as a follow-up to my question for Lori. We did get another question here. This is for Todd again. Will Highland train your staff for maintenance, or will Highland do that?
So we, with the purchase of our vehicles, we always build training into our bid specs. And so while Highland will be purchasing the vehicles now, they're using our specifications that we used. And so between Thomas Built Buses and the local dealer, they will be providing the training to our technicians. And we agreed, we put in our RFP that we wanted the vendor to pay all the costs of maintenance, but we wanted them to buy those services from us. So I didn't want to lose employees in this deal. And we run 5 full repair shops. And so we're going to continue to run those, although I think they will decrease in size of staff over time through the reduction in the amount of maintenance the EVs need. But I think that'll happen through natural attrition. But they're going to be paying us for the maintenance work, and Thomas Built Buses and our local dealer, American Bus Sales, will be doing the training of our technicians. And while I have the floor, I just wanted to throw in one other challenge. Lori was talking about some of the challenges. I think one other challenge in this space is going to be, we have a nice, neat package where we get to install lots of charging infrastructure on depots where we have hundreds of buses, but lots of school buses across the country park at individual homes of the driver. And so I think that is something to be figured out also, like what is the charging infrastructure and the reimbursement of costs to maybe out of that house, if that's where the electric comes from or whatever, I think will be one of the challenges to figure out as this spreads.
Thank you, Todd. I had not thought about that. We have another question. It's not directed at anybody, so if anybody wants to jump in and take a stab at it. The question is, are most commission-approved utility EV school bus programs providing a rebate on the cost of the school bus? How have commissions supported the pursuit of alternative business models like the one Todd's school district is engaged in?
I'll jump in here. I think that to date, most of the commission-approved programs are through the rebate approach. The Highland Electric model that Todd so eloquently spelled out, and in which he clearly worked out a really good deal. Highland Electric, I believe that Montgomery County Schools was one of the very first deals, and certainly the biggest deal to date that Highland Electric has announced. And so it's a relatively new model, one that we're very optimistic can happen elsewhere. Part of the thing that makes it different is the levels of possible rebates or flow back of revenue, which varies across the RTOs at this point in the country. So anyway, I was also going to quickly mention and respond to a couple of the last questions. I think Todd is right that training, it's great that he got it in his contract. We've had conversations with the OEMs, and at this point, all of the electric school bus manufacturers should be expected to provide training in every sale of an electric school bus. That should be insisted upon and would not come as any surprise, but it's great that Todd worked that in. And lastly, I wanted to comment quickly on and agree with Lori on the issue about the scale of production of electric school buses being an issue. There's really positive news on that right now. Lion Electric, which to date has so far produced more electric school buses than any of the other manufacturers, recently announced that it's opening the largest facility for heavy duty and medium duty electric manufacturing in the US in Joliet, Illinois. So the production is rising. Lori's right, that needs to happen, but it's as school districts make the kinds of commitments that Montgomery County is making, it's going to make it easier for the production to rise to meet the demand.
I think one note on production, I've seen some folks talk about in some of these webinars I've done or whatever, that wouldn't it be great if we got just a huge surge of funding and we went out and replaced some huge chunk of the 480,000 buses. And while that might make environmental sense, I think an approach where we replace them kind of in a life cycle manner, that's what we're doing. So we're going to replace 1/12 of our fleet each year because we plan to use them for 12 years. And I would not be interested in something that came in and said, here's money, go replace 50% of your vehicles right now, because then 12 years from now, right, I'm going to have to replace 50% of them again. And so I think that while there's the environmental incentive to do it really quickly, I think we have to think about what's practical in terms of replacement cycles for vehicles also.
That's right,
Thank you.
Todd.
Yeah, thank you guys. I think we are out of time, so I'm going to turn it back over to Jasmine, but thank you again to all of our speakers. This is very interesting and of course, very, very timely. We talk about things like fleets and of course, school buses.